Hi, everyone. Good morning. So we'll just go through a quick agenda for this working group meeting. Thanks for being here. I know a lot of you have been thinking about this since the straw proposal came out, some before, and there's been a lot of work that's also gone into it from a number of you offline. So thank you for that. Thanks for being here. We're going to start with, I think you all know now the objectives of the scoring criteria, but we really want to make sure that these are something that we can effectively apply to right-size the number of interconnection requests that move on to the study process, and hopefully to minimize the auction process as well. But in order to do that, they need to be very clearly spelled out and very easy to validate for us, because we're going to have a very quick process now as we implement Order 2023 from FERC. So that's why we're all here. We're going to focus on trying to get through the entire scoring rubric that was proposed in the draft straw proposal, but I know some of you have given it a lot of thought beyond that, and so we're going to invite very direct feedback. Like if you want to say, delete this whole category, we'll kind of see what the show of hands is in the room, and we can talk about that. So you can be blunt with your recommendations. I think this is a hopefully collaborative place where we all just want to move on and make progress and get this right. So hopefully all of our intentions are aligned there. Obviously we'll be polite, but no, just be direct. And then I will give you, before we jump into that, I'll give you an update on the schedule and timeline. We also have a little bit of site control information that was requested at the last stakeholder working group meeting. And then we have a couple of proposals that I think we'll probably touch on as we go through the straw proposal scoring criteria, but just want to make sure that we give those time to, if they don't have time to fully come out in that discussion, that there's a little time to kind of round those out at the end. And then we'll discuss next steps. I know there's been a lot of discussion around the pace of these working groups, the pace of this initiative as a whole, what we're all aiming toward. So we will figure out next steps together. But first, just a couple quick updates. I just talked through all of this. Yeah, I think we're good there. Okay, so some information that you all have been asking for. As we've shared before, we now have to comply with FERC Order 2023, and we'll implement the proposals in this paper before we re-engage with Cluster 15 for the interconnection request validation process and the studies. We still plan to comply with Order 2023 on time. So the deadline has, I know many of you know that the deadline has been extended now to April 3rd. That is our time frame for compliance. We continue to plan to comply as fully as we possibly can with the FERC order. We are not proposing to open an interconnection, or we're proposing not to open an interconnection request window in 2024. So we just want to put that out there now. That's just to manage the volume that we currently have and the shifting volumes that we'll have in Cluster 15 and let things settle out. And just to reiterate this again and be as clear and transparent and give you as much notice as we possibly can, we do still intend for it to be part of our compliance to apply Order 2023 to Cluster 15, including the site control requirements. Any questions there? Okay, so more immediate, yes, Renee.
Sorry, just this is Renee Steichen from Rev Renewables. On the Order 2023, I was just waiting to see, I guess, if you had another slide on it, but wondering when we'll be able to see a draft of the full plan, like all the details.
We do not share drafts of compliance filings. Those will all be internal ISO documents.
Even a presentation of what you plan to file?
Yeah, I don't think we're committed to doing that, because we have a lot of our own internal process to make sure that we're clear on exactly what goes into it.
Okay. I mean, I know a lot of other ISO RTOs are doing stakeholder presentations about what they're planning to do. I guess, can you share a little bit more? Are you expecting just like the base requirements on that? Like with study deposits, withdrawal, things like that?
I think, yeah, I mean, we're planning as full compliance as we possibly can with minimal exceptions.
Okay. All right, thanks.
We do have 4 or 5 hands on WebEx if we want to move to them.
Okay,
Okay.
sounds good.
So Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting, go ahead.
Hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just sort of following up on the Rev Renewables question. I wonder if it would be possible to put out, when you say Kaisa's been saying as fully as possible, and I know we've talked a little about site control, and then there's the question we just talked about, the study deposits and all that. Is there any way and I know you're not going to share the compliance filing draft, but is there any way to just get a list? I mean, it could, be bullet points even, just on the specific requirements that you expect to apply to cluster 15. Would it be possible for you to issue that, just in terms of informing people?
We can take that request back, Susan.
Okay,
No,
sorry. Thank you very much. That would be
a commitment right now, but we'll look at it.
okay. Thank you. That would be extremely helpful, and give people as much notice as possible before you get back to the cluster 15 projects, so people can know what to do. I know there's for example, the site exclusivity. If people withdraw by April 1st, they get their deposit back, and there's a few other things in there that it would be good for people to have that information now, so they can start making decisions about what they are going to do with their cluster 15 projects.
Okay.
So thank you for considering that.
Thank you. Let's go to Grant Glazer.
Can you go back one slide, please? Not seeing it change on my screen, but I can just ask the question regardless. Thank you. This first bullet here, I understand that CAISO has to implement Order 2023 reforms before moving forward with Cluster 15. I guess I'm wondering on whether the proposals in the straw proposal or in this paper are also implemented before re-engaging with Cluster 15. Is that similarly a requirement, or is this a preference of CAISO?
I think it's a requirement of our Track 1 filing, as well as the internal plan at the ISO. I mean, I think to some extent, Track 1 of the interconnection request process kind of enabled these process changes so that we could look at more significant changes in Track 2. So we're in Track 2 now, and the whole purpose of this track is to develop process enhancements that we can apply to Cluster 15.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. And then I guess just a quick follow-up, would CAISO be open to some sort of phased implementation, or I guess a subset of reforms that get specified in Track 2 apply to Cluster 15, and then if there's other stuff that stakeholders are still working on, could the stakeholders have time to continue working on those after Cluster 15 has started that would then be applied to subsequent clusters?
Yeah, I think there's a balance there. We're certainly open to it, but I just want to emphasize for this whole group, all the stakeholders, that we really need to make transformative changes in this track of this process before we re-engage with Cluster 15. We have far more interconnection requests than we can reasonably study, and I think far more interconnection requests than you all would want us to study. So we need to really make sure that we keep the meat of a lot of the new ideas that we're talking about and are focused enough to apply some pretty big new enhancements to Cluster 15. That's not to say that there won't be things that will come up after it. So I think there is some openness to thinking through that. you know, as we get closer to needing to bring this to the board and to file this with FERC. But we are really trying, and I think you all can feel this, we're really trying to continue to make some significant progress in this track of the initiative.
That makes sense. Thank you.
All right, Mark Smith, go ahead.
I'm curious about the timing of when you would reopen cluster 15, given what I think I hear you say are going to be 2 independent filings at FERC, one being a compliance filing and the second being a track 2 filing. If the track 2 filing doesn't go in until, let's say, February or March, 90 days later would be July, roughly. Is that the kind of time frame now that you're looking at reopening cluster 15 studies, July, August of 24?
I believe, and Bobby might need to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we currently have to resume validation of cluster 15 by September of 2024. So that's the time frame that we have been working under.
Yeah, this is Bob with the ISO. Yeah, our currently, I believe it's Appendix DD Section 17 says we have to have validation completed by the first half of September 2024. That was all based off of what we knew when we filed that in track 1. We didn't know we'd be dealing with a FERC order, and so we'll have to see on that one. You know, I'll just kind of state the obvious thing is FERC compliance filing orders aren't necessarily provided back to the filers within the typical 60 days of a 205 filing. So that can take some time. Historically, it's taken a number of months longer than that. And then we have to determine how we're going to move forward if we file our 205 filing for phase 2, how we're going to move forward with that if we don't have a FERC order on all these things. So these are things that we're trying to figure out the best strategy on how we're going to deal with this. And we're still working through that, having some conversations with FERC at the level that we can related to this. So there are some things that are a bit unknown at this point in time.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I really appreciate that, and I don't envy your position with all these uncertainties. Just one final request, and it's a tactical request that since we have 6 or 9 months at this point, it would be super helpful if the ISO could indicate, and I know a number of people have said this already, whether current queue positions would be considered essentially option A or option B. If they're option A and they don't have site control, you know, we can go out and get site control. If they're option B, it's a complete waste of money to go out and lease land, and et cetera, if they're going to be in the option B category where people have to pay for upgrades. Most likely those would be dropped. So don't make us spend wasteful money, I guess. Let us know whether we're in or out of the zones that you have. Thanks. That's just a request. No need to respond. Thank you.
All right, so we have about 2 more hands on WebEx and a comment in the chat. So let's move to Ryan Millard.
Actually had my question. I guess all I would say on top of that is if you could keep us posted as you get a little bit more clarity on the timing, I think that's going to be critically important for stakeholders. So that's all I had. Thanks.
All right, William Whitehead, go ahead.
Our timeline to file is tied to when CAISO decides to file with make its filing for FERC Order 2023. It says you plan to comply with the order as quickly as possible. Does CAISO have an idea of when before April 3rd that filing would be? Are we talking about filing a little earlier than that deadline, because that's going to set the date that we have to make updates to our WDATs. And then I guess the follow-on question is if there, or more of a request, if there's any runway that CAISO could provide us so that we can prepare our filings, then that would definitely be appreciated.
William, yeah, we understand that. We will try to, I can't right now provide any more detail around our actual compliance filing deadline or date, if it is before the deadline, but we understand the nature of the request and the rationale behind it, and we can try to get you more information if we get there and when we get there.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
A question in the chat from Orjit Ghoshal with ES Volta. Will any Order 2023 compliance items apply to Cluster 14 or earlier clusters?
That is a good question. I think, Deb, do you want to?
Yeah, there's a potential that it would apply to Cluster 14 and earlier. Once the GIA has been approved by FERC as being the new GIA, we have to use that GIA for execution of any contracts. So to the extent you are a project in Cluster 14 and back and don't get your GIA executed by the time we file the compliance filing, you'll be looking at filing the GIA associated with the FERC 2023 order.
All right, that's all we have online.
Okay, I do have one more slide on this, just with some near-term deadlines. And so I think something that I know you all are actively interested in is finding out and making sure that some of the feedback that we take from all of you and that we discussed today is going to be incorporated into the next paper. We will shift the timeline for the next paper to make sure that we are able to incorporate all the feedback, not only from today, but also from the stakeholder working group meeting that we have planned on November 15th too. So the actual posting date of that paper is we're still working through what a reasonable timeline is, especially working around the holidays and other busy calendars. But I just want you to know that we make that commitment to you that we will have another stakeholder working group after today. It's a full day working group, and then we'll be able to incorporate all of that into the next iteration of the paper. Yeah, Renee?
Renee Steichen from Rev Renewables. Thank you for that. I think, as you'll probably hear today, and if you did a poll, a lot of people are supportive of a delay on this, especially given the Order 2023 compliance delay. And we just want to make sure that this is the right approach and not rushed into it. So I think even a couple months delay would be welcome by stakeholders.
Okay. We do have a hand raised on WebEx. Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hi. I apologize for not getting in queue sooner, but just to follow up on Debbie's answer on the GIA execution. So if you have a proposal in here that older projects in the queue that have not yet executed GIAs will have to do that by a certain time and make their NTP and their third posting. So is the idea that even for those earlier clusters, JB was talking about cluster 14, but even those earlier clusters, projects from those clusters, or potentially maybe not even clusters, that they also will have to use the new LGIA or the new GIA form from FERC?
That's correct.
Okay, but I'm assuming that since some of the study process and other, the frequency response, there are a lot of things that have been added even to the more modern one. Well, anyway, it seems like you might have to go through and do some redlining just because some of the things that are in the newer ones might not apply to some of the older projects. I guess it's actually sort of a case-by-case thing.
Yes, it's on a case-by-case basis. However, I would note that to date, every time the ISO has implemented a new GIA, based on the date that it's approved by FERC, every contract, regardless of what cluster it is in, including serial and Amendment 39, would have to execute the then current LGIA. We don't allow anyone to go back and execute GIAs that are previous versions.
Right. Okay. All right. Thanks for the clarification.
All right, and then we have a question from Jasmine Guan with AES Clean Energy.
Hello, it's Jasmine from AES Clean Energy. I'm just curious if shifting the next paper to late November, would that affect the rest of the timeline that the ISO has so far?
Maybe. We're having those discussions right now. So.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, yeah, that sounds good. I think we would support what Rev was also just echoing, that we would also support any delay if that means that the proposal could be more thoroughly vetted as well. Thank you.
Okay. Last bit of information for you. We do need to move into scoring criteria. This is just an informational piece from the last conversation that we had last week. There were a lot of requests for a little more clarity and information around the types of information that will be provided to you all to inform the zonal approach. So what we plan to do around that, we're still refining that ourselves, but we understand the need for that data to be really crisp and clear to all of you. So what we can do is we will, as soon as we release the next paper, we will also schedule kind of an informational session or a workshop to talk through that specific component of it and make sure that everyone has a clear understanding of the types of information that we're proposing to share with you, how it can be used, and how it will then inform the rest of the process. The zonal approach, as you all know, is very kind of central to this whole proposal. So we understand that you need to understand it in order to make it all work. So details on that will be shared once the paper comes out, or once we have a clear time frame. Okay, so let's move on into the scoring rubric. As I said, the goal today, oh, just kidding, sorry. We have one more slide, information that was requested last week. So Bob's going to present a little bit of detail on the site control data.
So I'm not going to speak a lot to these numbers. You can see these and draw your conclusions from them. But we wanted to provide this data. This was something that's been asked a number of times and is of interest to us as well. So just to get a feel, you know, we provided two sets of numbers. One is what the number of projects that requested site exclusivity or provided actual deposits versus actual documents for site exclusivity, as in the tariff right now. How many at the time they submitted their IRs, both for cluster 14 and cluster 15. You can see the numbers are fairly consistent between the two. Slightly more in cluster 15 provided documents. And then where we stand as of the cluster key report today. And it shows how many currently have documents versus the deposits. And also we're showing the withdrawn projects and what status they were in when they withdrew. So hopefully this provides the information when we get into the current. We also provide it both by project and by megawatts. So you can have it both ways. Does anybody have any questions on any of this?
We do have a question on the line. Susan Schneider, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, it's Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Thank you very much for providing this and also providing the megawatt data, which I think are very interesting. But this is the slide is entitled site control data, and what you provided is what is required under the CAISO tariff, which is the site exclusivity. My impression is that the site control requirements are possibly more stringent than the site exclusivity requirements. Is that your impression as well, or is that your thought right now?
Yeah, and that's a good catch. That should be site exclusivity data, which site exclusivity for the ISO tariff is 50% of the property, the land. The site has to be under control, where the site control that FERC is put in their order is 90%. So that's the main change between what we currently have in our tariff and what we are expecting to be using for cluster 15 once we re-engage cluster 15 is the actual FERC site control requirement of 90%, which then moves to 100% site control requirement when the project goes into the GIA process.
Okay, so would it be reasonable to expect, and I imagine people are working on this right now, as Mark Smith had mentioned, but it's possible that something like half of the projects and/or megawatts might not make it through this process. Are you thinking about that? That maybe that might be true as well?
I'm sorry, Susan, can you repeat the question?
Oh, well,
distracted.
it seems like based on what's here and the idea that the site control requirements are more, as you mentioned, more stringent than just site exclusivity, it's possible that you might lose half of the applications and/or megawatts or more potentially by the time you get to this.
Well, if I understand your question, we are providing a process to where projects can renew their interconnection request once we re-engage. And if projects want to change the size of their project, you can't increase the megawatts, but you could always decrease the megawatts if, in order to get site exclusivity, you need to be able to do that. You know, that is going to be an opportunity that interconnection customers will be able to use. And I see Kaylee's has a question or a comment.
Hi, this is
Okay,
Kaylee.
that's all my questions. Thanks.
Susan, this is Kaylee Zuberry with California ISO. In compiling this data, we didn't go through all the documents for cluster 14, but when we did site exclusivity for cluster 15, most, if not all, of the documents provided had site control. So going forward, there will be a form that is filled out for site control, and we will be able to quickly see which projects have full control and which are lacking in that area.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that. You said that almost all the cluster 15 projects do have it. It shows 42%. I'm not sure I understood your clarification.
So of the projects that submitted site demonstration documents, site exclusivity documents, like that 44%, those 223 projects, most of those projects have site control. The 90%. I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That is helpful to know. That's all I had. Thanks.
Okay, we did have a chat question from Jason Buren with GridStore. To be clear, does site control in this slide refer to greater than 50% site control or 100%?
This slide represents actually site exclusivity as it's in our tariff, which only requires 50%. But as Kaylee said, most projects that provided documents actually met the 90% level. But the requirement at this stage is still the 50% level.
All right, and then we do have a hand raised online. Virginia Groves with Southern California Edison. Um,
Can you hear me? This is Loic Gaillac.
I'm trying to unmute. Yeah, I'm trying to unmute her. The system wasn't letting me. Okay,
Can you hear me
Virginia,
now?
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, this is Loic Gaillac with SE. Can you hear
Yes,
me?
go ahead. Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Sorry, can we infer from the data presented that site exclusivity as defined in the FERC order is not going to be a sufficient criteria to bring the number of applicants to the targets we have, which is 150% of the available capacity?
I'm sorry, this is Bob. I'm not sure if that was a statement or a question.
Well, that was a question. So is it reasonable to infer that based on the data you presented and the explanation you provided about the nuance between site control and site exclusivity, that the application of the FERC order as it relates to site control will not be sufficient by itself to limit the number of applications to be studied to the target we have in track 2?
I think that's been the assumption of the ISO, that that's the case, that the demonstration of the FERC required site control will not be sufficient to limit the number of projects that we believe are the right amount to study. And looking at this data here, we see that cluster 15, as of today, 42% and 223 projects have, according to Kaylee, have basically demonstrated the FERC required site control. And I assume more to come over the months ahead as projects have more opportunity and time to actually demonstrate that. So from my perspective, I think the answer is that site control by itself at the FERC level will not reduce the number of projects to the level that we wouldn't have to move forward with some sort of additional criteria, such as scoring criteria, and potentially even beyond that, an auction process.
Thank you.
all right, Mark Smith, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. It's Mark with Calpine again. I mean, this data just reinforces my earlier comment, Bob. I mean, we have apparently over 300 projects that are out there hunting for land probably right now, searching for leases, driving up real estate values, maybe unnecessarily. So to the extent that you can provide us early notice of whether these resources are in the zones or out of the zones, and it doesn't have to be binding, it's just an indication from you that based on your current proposal, these are in or out. I think it would be an incredibly efficient and helpful measure by the ISO. Is that something that you think that you can do, Bob?
I think it's, let me put it this way, I think it's a reasonable request, and I think it's something that I agree with, that we should do our best efforts to do that. So we'll have to work with the engineering group and work through that and see what we can do and how fast we can do that.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Bob.
All right, that's all we have online.
Hey, Mark, this is Jason with the ISO. If the ISO is to publish this information and determine in and out of zones or applicability, would projects be willing to withdraw their cluster 15 applications to help provide the ISO improved numbers and values of what we'd be looking at going forward?
And if we could unmute Mark's line again, we'll be able to respond.
I would say, Jason, if it appears to me that I'm going to be in option B and have to pay for some ungodly cost of network upgrades, I'm not going to negotiate a site lease, and I would drop. I suspect others might be in a similar situation. Does that help?
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
All right. We do have a hand raised. Aisha Berry, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Just 1 minute. Hello?
So go ahead, we can hear
Yes.
you.
Yeah, Caitlin, thank you. Sorry, always a problem. Still getting used to this. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to ask, and I think this is not, there might not be an answer, but right now, so are we striving for a particular number of queues or certain megawatts? Like, even if through the scoring criteria, whenever we decide that, is there gonna be like a target number of projects that we would like to keep in the queue that we know can be realistically studied, or a target, or it'll be purely like, it'll be, I guess it might more be like whatever is the deliverability and all those things, more than 20% or 50% of the deliverability. That is the target, right? It's based on the megawatts, not necessarily the number of projects, right? So where I'm trying to get is, how would we know what we proposed actually worked? Would it be hitting that target number of megawatts, or the number of projects? Like right now we were saying, because 50% projects have met their site control, we can infer from that we still cannot get down to the number of projects that we want to study. So I was just curious, like, what is the target? Like, how can we infer that it worked? This worked.
So Aisha, good question. This is Danielle. I think your question sort of points to why we're all here, which is to talk through the scoring criteria. I think the site control data is just information we were sharing to give you all a snapshot of what we can sort of anticipate for cluster 15 and cluster 14, and how, you know, the sort of blunt baseline entry level requirement will have some impact, but I think, to your point, is not something that we can scale or have that there's much control over. So that's why we, you know, see that as taking that FERC requirement and applying it at the beginning of our process. We'll do some scaling of the queue, but then beyond that, there will still likely be need to apply additional screens like the scoring criteria and potentially an auction to get us to that 150%, which is, you know, at least what was proposed in the Straw proposal. So the 150% is sort of the number that we're looking at right now as a way of right sizing, and that's in megawatts, not in terms of number of projects.
Yeah.
But there is an interaction between these entry-level requirements and the later screens that we propose to apply.
That makes sense, Daniel. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Because with the site control, it might be interesting to just convert the number of projects into megawatts, and then into how much times the deliverability, or something, like whether right now it's 1,000% more than what it's supposed to be, and we want to get down to 150. That's just like I'm not sure if that's necessary, but yeah, like something like how far we are versus where we need to go post the scoring criteria at some point of time.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, but appreciate the explanation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to suggest, I don't know if there are any more questions, but I'm going to suggest that we move to scoring criteria now. And while we do that, I think Caitlin's going to put the rubric up on the screen, and we can do some changes. We can track change it if we need to, but I want to first acknowledge, I know at the end of our last working group meeting, there was, you know, a discussion around the need to continue to talk around these things. A number of stakeholders kind of organized themselves and volunteered to have some side conversations over the last couple of weeks. I was able to observe some of those, so thank you for including me in those. They have made some progress, and I want to make sure that that progress continues. for the sake of today, I'm just posting pretty much the blank scoring rubric that was proposed in the straw proposal. This one actually has a couple of notes based on those conversations that we can look at. But we're going to give Rev and GridStore, and I know Edison made a proposal last week, so we want to make sure that those proposals come out in this discussion, and then if there's a need at the end to kind of have them wrap up their whole proposal, we can do that as well. But let's jump into the scoring criteria. Yeah, Bob's gonna.
I just want to, it's kind of loud, reiterate and make sure we're all on the same page, that through the scoring process, we've gotten some comments such as, could we have an appeals process? And in my mind also, there's potential I could see where people may say, well, gosh, I want to seek for a waiver of your decision or why you chose that. And we don't want to be in a mode where I don't think we have time for an appeals process. And frankly, my concern is if we have an appeals process, everybody loses out, we'll appeal. And, we just don't have time to go through that kind of a process, especially within the FERC timeframe that we've given in the FERC order. So I just want to make it clear that the goal, at least my goal from this, is to have a process that's as clean as we can get it, as transparent as we can get it, to where we don't need an appeals process, at least customers don't feel they need an appeals process, and we don't have people contemplating, oh, I didn't get chosen, so I'm going to see if we can file a waiver of FERC to get our project in. We need to make it very clean, and as also has been said many times, is it has to be something that's implementable to where our validation of this scoring criteria is very clean and not subjective. It has to be very objective, black and white, and quick, so that we can do it in a timely basis. So those are some of the goals, at least that I have behind the scoring criteria.
Okay, and I want to put one more disclaimer on this. This is an attempt to include some ideas that were discussed in the subgroup. It is not comprehensive of all of the stakeholder comments. It's imperfect, but it's a starting point. So like I said, don't hold back, be direct, but also don't expect that this is the perfect document, and it's also going to change a lot. So let's just go from here and see where we can get. One other note is that we do have the ability to do Slido polls, if I'm saying that right. So we may, if someone wants to suggest a poll that we can do, feel free to do that. And Caitlin can explain how we do that when we get there. Yeah. Well, for the people in the room, we'll just have an actual straw poll rather than a virtual-based app, real life. So first item, oh, and the other thing I'll note about this document is that the orange items, or kind of like rust-colored items, are just things that I highlighted that we've heard a lot of concern around. So I didn't want to totally strike them, but I understand that there's some concern there. So we're going to go through this category by category. We may only have like 10 minutes for each one, so let's jump in. The first one, we heard a lot of concern on this, and there is an alternate proposal out there from Edison and some other LSEs. And this is the idea of how to capture interest from an off-taker. It's something that the ISO feels is very important to have some pulse on earlier in the interconnection process, but we recognize that there's challenges with how official and binding this interest could be, and also how to validate it. So I don't, Edison may be on the line. I think the proposal that they made last week was to have LSEs allocated at a certain amount of points where they're able to, I think the points are based on load share that they're able to then use to kind of rank projects or select moving projects into the next round. There was also a stakeholder discussion around some modification on that we can talk through as well. I see Lauren's card up, so I'm going to go to her first.
Hi, this is Lauren Carr from CalCCA. I think I said this last meeting, but we were supportive of the point system that Edison proposed. I did have, I guess, a question or maybe a concern with the modification, which is only requests that don't meet a procurement order would be awarded such points. It seems like if an LSE is interested in a project that would meet a procurement order, it should be able to assign points to that project. I don't see why there would need to be kind of a carve out and only projects that don't meet procurement orders would get points. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. So I would be supportive of the proposed change without the modification that LSEs can assign it to any project that they're interested in.
All right. Well, we have a couple hands on WebEx. We have about 5 hands on WebEx, so we'll get through those. Jason Buren with Grid Store, go ahead.
You able to hear me?
Jason, your line is unmuted.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for this, and thank you to the last speaker. I think was responding to something we'd brought up in the sort of stakeholder subgroups that were held informally. Yeah, I think that, you know, and I'm gonna first just build on Southern California Edison's proposal here rather than, I think, the letter of interest, which seems to have consensus amongst stakeholders that that will not work. I think that the main considerations I would like to see is, one, I'd like to see an implementable model of what Southern California Edison has proposed in terms of having a set of points to distribute for each LSE. I think it's easy to say that in the abstract, but like actually stepping through all of the considerations. How many points are available across all the LSEs? How are those points allocated to the LSEs? What can the LSEs award points to? How many can they award to a given project? Like, you have to step through those things, I think, because the ultimate actual outcomes and what this will mean are only going to become more understandable if we actually try to set up the exercise and walk through it. The second thing I would add to that is that I do think it's important here to understand, to put some rationales around this concept, right? Like, the goal is to help winnow interconnection requests using interest from an off-taker as a criterion. What's the limiting factor here? I think that the reason I mention that is because I am concerned that if off-taker interest becomes determinative of project entry for a large or majority of projects, this ISO process will be in violation of open access principles. Off-taker interest should not determine who does and does not get studied for interconnection. And so I think, in my mind, the limiting principles are, one, if LSE interest is going to be a scoring criteria, it should probably be determinative of the outcomes of a minority of projects, not a majority, just to make sure that we are balancing the interest in open access here with reflecting off-taker interest. And second, I think it's important to recognize that as much as possible, this process should use objective criteria. I think that when we move to subjective criteria, that this becomes less legible from a policy standpoint. And in the interest of making something that is understandable and as close to predictable as possible, we should minimize the use of subjective rather than objective criteria. So with that in mind, I will simply note that I have come up with a proposed alternative, but I will leave that for a later conversation if folks would like.
Thank you. Let's go to Loic Gaillac with Southern California Edison.
And for the feedback, I mean, I think fundamentally we're not in disagreement here. We certainly, want to demonstrate interest in a manner that is more appropriate than a simple letter of interest. So we kind of went back and forth in an area of mechanism to do that. We believe that that point system allowed us to achieve that. I agree, Jason, that we need to put together that point system in more detail and what that look like. So we can commit, as he can commit, take the lead and prepare a full detailed point allocation system here so that we can look at concrete example. I do agree, Jason, with you, and as we discussed via email, that it should not be a determinant factor in that selection process. And that's not the intent. And if you recall in our proposal, this approach of LSE points was balanced by another path that was providing the same amount of points based on, which I think is still on the screen, based on element that for which you could pursue, and we talk about shortlisting and a few other things. So there was a separate path in place to acquire the same amount of points than the LSE interest. So, and the intent behind that was simply, as you described, to ensure that the LSE points were not the determining factor in that selection, and that you could capture as many points without any direct LSE points bonus. But I agree with the idea of putting together a detailed criteria so that we can look at concrete example. And certainly those points should be limited. It should not be, it should not be something you can assign to the entire set of, project in the, the 150% target project. So I think we'll take the commitment before the next meeting to frame what such a point system could look like. But I think addressing your concern and other, it should be balanced. I mean, it is balanced by the fact that there's another path that allowed you to get the same amount of points. And I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Let's continue and go to Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm trying to understand, first of all, when you have a column here that says proposed changes, is this the CAISO's proposed changes?
No, Susan, these are changes that were explored in the small subgroup
Okay.
and in the last stakeholder session with SE's proposal here. And now I'm just using it for notes. So again, imperfect, but hopefully a way to capture ideas.
Okay, and then I guess I'm a little bit confused, and I know we're getting to maybe the next section too, but also this one. There was a proposal to exempt projects that were in, I thought it was non-CPUC, LSE resource plans from this whole point system. And now we've got, so you've got that sort of category. Then you've got a category here that says meeting IRRs that may meet procurement orders. And then in the next one, you've got a preferred resource and an LRA approved. It doesn't say non-CPUC. I guess I'm just a little confused about, are there projects that are going to be exempt from still, or are you thinking are there the projects will be, there are some that will be exempt from the point system? And what is the difference between being in a resource plan that was approved by an LRA or a non-CPUC LRA, or something that's in a procurement order? Do these have to be specifically named projects, or just to say, well, this is in, compliance with the procurement order? I'm really confused about kind of where you think you might be headed with that whole, who's going to use the point system and who isn't, by a particular project.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful feedback. I think I can answer your question kind of at a high level, but I think we're going to wait to get down into the merits or cons of some of the potential cons of some of the other ideas that are down in the lower categories. What we were trying to do is, so the broader goal of all of this is to identify projects that are most commercially ready to move forward. It's not really the right sizing piece, it's the picking the best projects or identifying the right projects based on hopefully an objective criteria, that system that we can use that allows for, you know, different amounts of projects to move forward. So if there are a lot of really ready projects, then those can move forward. So that's the broader goal. When we have a couple of different categories here, it's because we see them somewhat differently. So we saw interest from an off-taker being something that was different from whether a project simply meets the requirement of a CPUC midterm reliability procurement order or RA, whatever, you know, is an RA project or things like that. So that's why we have them in different places. We can toy around with where they actually belong, but I think right now, for the sake of conversation, we want to focus on the pros and cons of the actual categories that we're talking about, figure out what to keep and what to strike, and then we can go through a process to sort of rank them. So I would also say along those lines, just ignore the points values for now. Once we get through what are reasonable indicators and criteria, then we can kind of go through and figure out what's reasonable and what is expected at a given point, and when it should be, whether it should be applied in the scoring criteria or later.
Yeah, because it seems to me that the first two categories, the interest from an off-taker and commercial readiness, which is basically also reflects interest from an off-taker, those seem completely duplicative. Because they're both having to do with interest from an off-taker. So there's that issue, and then again, you know, which projects are some projects exempt from this? Are all projects subject to this? And if it's an and I also don't see where a non-LSE off-taker, you know, there's some discussion in the papers about eligible non-LSE off-takers. I don't see how that fits into the point system or anything else in these first two categories. So I guess I just, it seems to me that just the first two both are for LSE interest. Non-LSEs don't seem to be represented here. Some projects may not be subject to this. It may make a difference if the LRA is the CPUC or somebody else. And if something is in a procurement order, does it have to mention the exact project, or is that just a general category of stuff that people can, LSEs can say, well, it's in a procurement order, therefore that gets grandfathered. I'm just really struggling with this, what looks like duplication and just a lack of clarity on what's exactly covered by this system and what isn't.
Understood, and that's why we're here. So I'm going to suggest, I don't know how many more questions are in the queue, but I'm going to suggest, it seems like nobody likes the idea of a letter of interest from an off-taker, so I'm going to suggest we just strike that, or we can do a Slido poll / hands up of whether we should strike the specific criteria of having letters be used as a points mechanism.
Well, so when you say letters, is that letters that tell people what the point, you know, what points they're allocating? Or is this a separate, is the letter of interest separate from a point system? Or
yeah, it's separate from a point system. I'm talking about what's in the left-hand column that was in the straw proposal.
No letters of interest, this means no limit on how many projects or what megawatts or any LSE could designate that. That's what that means.
Yeah, it means that if you could get someone to write a letter for you, an off-taker to write a letter for you that said, we like this project, you would get 20 points. We didn't flesh it out more than that because we thought we'd put it in the straw proposal to see what people thought. If people think that there's merit and we should add some detail to it, then we can continue to do that. But I'm not seeing a lot of head nodding that this is like a great metric of whether a project should proceed.
Well, I guess just I need to get off this and let somebody else talk. But just you wanted blunt. Yeah, that does seem a little flaky. But you wanted blunt and direct criteria, you know, comments on this. And I think the first two categories on the left column are basically indicate exactly the same thing. And you need to be specific on. And I think in general, all the projects should have to go by. Some kind of, you know, be subject to the scoring criteria. I don't see any reason to exempt them, and I certainly don't see any reason to exempt non-CPUC jurisdictional, you know, resource plans from others. And if projects get to somehow skip or do something, get something special because they're in somebody's resource plan, or because there are some kind of procurement order compliance, it should be project specific and not just sort of a general category. Okay,
We hear you on that, but we're going to go through each individual one by one. Right now, we're just looking at the letter of interest. We're going to get to the others. So, and we'll also get to the question of non-CPUC jurisdictional LFEs. But right now, I'm trying to keep this conversation really focused so that we can move through the whole list. And I understand that you see a lot of them as redundant and duplicative, but I would prefer to take it one by one.
Okay, I'll lower my hand then. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Do people want to do a poll, or do people just want to say, take the letter of interest out? Poll. All right. Caitlin is going to walk us through how that works.
So yes, we're going to try something and do it live. So let's do this real quick. Yeah, so for those that are in the room, you can go to on your phone, or if you have your laptop out, I'll post it as I bring up the document right now.
And as Caitlin does that, I think we're just talking about this poll is just about letter of interest. It's not about the alternative proposal from SCE. So we're just talking about striking what's in that left-hand column. We might have another poll to talk about whether we should explore the idea of using the point system or modifications to the point system that Edison proposed. But right now we're just deciding, is a letter of interest a bad idea or a good idea?
So I will put, for those on the room, the website. And then we'll make this bigger for you. There is not any in there. I think just. Okay, so hopefully the folks in the room here can see the, so the website is there at the top, and then that access code, 849336.
But to be clear, we don't want people in the room voting on the website. We don't want people voting twice, because we're going to do a show of hands here in the room.
So, yeah, if we do it all online, we'll have the data that we can kind of share or look at later. It's really.
Is everyone online? Okay.
Okay. Again, we're going to try this and see how it works out, and we'll try to edit these questions live. So, Michelle on WebEx, I'm going to share a question on the screen for folks. All right, so everyone online, in a second here or so, you should see the Slido poll pop up on the right side of your screen, typically where the chat or the participants are. The website and entry code at the top is for the folks in the room here. Did it work for anybody in the room? No? Okay.
All right, stand by, everybody, as I'm attempting to get the poll to pop up for the online viewers.
Yeah, and I see people on online can't access it yet, so they're still opening it up. I think our second poll question.
While we get that working, I think one question before we get into each criteria, some of these we may be okay keeping those in if they are at a later stage. So is the question that do we need it at this entry point and no other option?
Good question. I understand that there is some sequencing of this as projects evolve and develop. Right now, it's just, does this work as an initial piece of the scoring criteria? But to get into the study, yeah. But the broader, Sushant's point about like identifying different categories or indicators that might be more appropriate later in the process, feel free to flag those. We'll take note. that'll be, you know, something that we can consider when we think through TPD allocations and things like that too.
And just to speak to that a little bit more, to be clear, we are thinking about 2 points. One is to get into the studies, so what we're discussing here, and then the other point system would be used for the TPD allocation process. We already have that within the TPD allocation process, but we want to make that more robust. So that's the other point that we are considering using this, and we hadn't really considered any midpoint beyond that. So, and just to lay that out.
Yes, I apologize to those of you online who are not able to see the poll. You should be able to hopefully click on the 3 dots that's right next to the chat box to see the poll. But I hear that some of you are not able to get that to pop up, so I'm trying to go ahead and fix that for you.
Yeah, I'm not able, this is Caitlin, I'm not able to see the poll either. And then I think for the folks in the room, the website link and code are not working. All right, I see a slide open. Okay, we're doing good here. Coming up. All right.
All right, everybody should see that online, hopefully.
All right. So the question's up on the screen in person and on WebEx. And then on the right side of your toolbar on WebEx, you can vote yes or no on this. And then I think folks in the room, hopefully it'll work. Still not working. Okay.
Yeah, can we do a kind of straw vote in the room and just see where everybody's at? Can you raise your hand if you are for? Your answer would be yes to this question.
And people online can raise hands too, I guess, on the chat.
Raise them high. Yes, this is yes. Yes to strike it. Okay, now those who would be opposed to strike this with a no answer.
People didn't vote, but I guess there's a lot of ISO staff in the room. Okay. I have 6 and 6.
Okay, so
online, we do have the poll working online, and we have about 50 respondents so far, 74% saying yes, and 26% saying no. Fix that.
Okay. Well, looks like it needs a little more work and refinement, but you probably can't hear me. I said it looks like it needs a little more work and refinement, but for the sake of just trying to get through the other criteria and maybe addressing some of Susan's other concerns too, let's move down into the next category of commercial readiness. And I also want to flag, I know that there are still subgroups planning to meet next week. If more people want to participate in those, let us know. But this does seem like an issue that those subgroups are equipped to continue to work through, and maybe there's some balance there between what the LSUs are proposing and the proposed modification, or some ways that we can kind of get at this question differently. So the other criteria that we have in the second column, we do have a question.
Yeah, this is Chris from TerraGen. I just wanted to comment on that point. I mean, I understand that there's some other subgroups going on, but these things should really just all be discussed transparently in the open as much as possible. So, I mean, and that, you know, we've been having discussions with some of those other groups, so I understand that stuff can happen, but I would not encourage CAISO to be encouraging more discussion offline and try to keep these in the work groups. And like the next one on November 15th, we should be talking through a lot of that stuff again, at least. I like what's going on here, but I'm just a little bit worried that, you know, if we push too much of this stuff outside of the normal stakeholder process, it's not very open and transparent.
Okay, that's helpful feedback. I think we are trying to balance the need to move things along pretty quickly and hoping that, we want this to be a stakeholder engaged process and have some ideas come from all of you. So we're trying to balance that, but we want to be transparent.
Yeah, that's very fair. Thanks.
And this is Jane Lockhart from NCPA, and I just want to note that when you're taking the polls, that you may have larger groups of some entities than others, and so I just ask that you take that into account.
Yep, noted. Thanks.
All right, we do also have 5 hands raised on WebEx, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm going to encourage quick and direct statements from all of you, so we can move on.
All right, Meg McNeil, go ahead.
Coburn for 6 Cities. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Couple of comments, and I'll try to be quick. Specifically with respect to the poll that just occurred, I want to flag that the answer to the question about removing the letter of intent maybe isn't a binary yes/no answer. I think on behalf of the group that I represent, we're interested in retaining some indication of LSE interest in a project as part of the scoring criteria. And whether that's the form of a letter of intent or, whether there's a points-based system or some other methodology, I think we do want to keep that as a component. So I think there just may be some nuances to those responses that might be helpful for the ISO to flesh out a little bit in discussion. Second, with respect to the points-based scoring system that Edison has proposed, want to really support the idea of examples in terms of how that would work. As someone who represents LSEs that are relatively small and that are not CPUC jurisdictional, we're very concerned about a load-based point system that would allow larger LSEs to effectively outvote or have their preferences carry more weight in terms of the projects that move forward relative to smaller entities. And then finally, with respect to the modification under the LSE interest category, you have this comment about interconnection requests not meeting procurement order requirements. To the extent that there's anything that sort of relates to CPUC practices, and I think maybe that's what that procurement order reference is referring to, we need to make sure that there's kind of an equivalent for non-CPUC jurisdictional entities to kind of have the same weighting or criteria there. And just in the interest of time, I'll stop.
Great, thanks.
Ryan Tracy with Sonoma Clean Power, go ahead.
I wanted to support SoCal Edison's approach for combining this section with the previous section. I think like Susan had brought up before, I think really they're going after the same aim. And I think that gets to the heart of why we really support a point-based system, is that it's a good way to judge commerciality of different projects, given a lot of projects aren't going to be at the contracting stage, the PPA stage. I did kind of want to talk to you a little bit about why I don't think looking at procurement orders or even in the previous meeting, it was brought up an idea of looking at the PSP is necessarily the right approach. I think the issue is we need interconnection requests to go through for kind of the open position. What LSEs see that hasn't been delivered yet, and they're really the best judges of that. Like Sonoma Clean Power, for instance, we know what part of our procurement order we've covered. We know what the resources we're going to need in the future are. So giving us the ability to have agency and making sure that the types of projects that make it through the interconnection request process are projects that we'd be interested in contracting for, I think is really important. And really quick on the question of implementation, I think this could be as simple as every load serving entity, like let's say you combine these two and you have 70 points. Every load serving entity could give each project up to 70 points, and then the CAISO just does a sum product of the load share and those number of points. So that allows, I could give every project 70 points, but I'm not going to have any agency then, in driving anything. So it would give each But I think it could be a pretty simple process. And I did also want to get ahead of one of the other concerns from developers have been that load serving entities, this early on aren't going to know the costs of different projects. But I think having the zonal approach and having CAISO only let projects through where there actually is high level regional capacity will help. And also with the heat map data that's going to be made available through the FERC 2023 process. I think having that data alongside the technologies and the megawatts and the locations will be really informative for load serving entities to choose the types of projects that they would be interested in contracting for.
Thanks.
All right. Eddie Zadasti with PARS Energy. Eddie, go ahead. Eddie,
you may be double mute.
All right, maybe we'll come back to Eddie. Let's go to Jean Lee with SCE.
Gene, I'll try and keep this brief because I know that's what we're trying to do. So just a couple points. On the what's listed there in modification, only IRs that do not meet procurement order requirements above may be awarded such points. I'm not sure that, I mean, I suppose there could be some cases of that, but I'm not sure of any LSEs who would want projects that don't meet procurement order requirements. So that statement seems like a zero-sum kind of statement, unless I'm misinterpreting it. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I'll respond after you finish.
Okay. There was, the comment about sort of like, well, is this in violation of open access? I mean, if the definition of open access is anyone should be able to get interconnected, sort of like regardless, then I would wager that all of these criteria are, I don't see anything in particular about sort of like interest from an off-taker that strikes that as particularly an issue. I mean, the process of winnowing down the queue in itself, is by the nature of it a restriction, which is necessary. Don't get me wrong, but it just seems like it's broader than that. And then my last point would be sort of there was a gentleman previously who talked about sort of like open and transparent, which I understand the desire for that. And if the goal is to gauge interest from an off-taker, and one way to go about it, if this is a suggestion, is to basically develop criteria on what projects people believe off-takers should be interested in. That's theoretically possible, but then by the nature of that, that's going to be a suboptimal activity. I mean, the most accurate representation, I've said this before, is just to ask the LSEs. So that's the extent of my comments. So I yield the floor.
Okay, thanks. And then I'm also going to make a couple other requests for the people who are in the queue. Please make your comments quick and direct, and also try not to reiterate comments that you filed in writing, because we've seen those. We really want this to be new ideas and really proposals like, what do we do with this? Can it stand? And if it can't stand like this, how do we make it work?
All right, we have 3 more folks online. We'll get through them quickly. So Doug Karpa with Peninsula Clean Energy, go ahead.
No, this was sort of apropos of the same conversation, and I apologize for not having given you written comments saying this, but again, I wanted to flag the problematic nature, or propose really a change in the tagging this to CPUC requirements. A number of us here are CCAs, and so we have actually additional requirements from our own boards that are like above and beyond what the CPUC is purporting to order. And those are more accurately reflected in the IRPs that we file. And so I might suggest swapping the like CPUC procurement order mix language for something along the lines of, meets the requirements of filed IRPs in the IRP process. Particularly, I think the aggregated portfolio that the CPUC produces from those filed IRPs is a better representation of both the CPUC requirements, but also the individual CCA requirements that come from our boards. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And for the last speaker too, I know you had a question on that proposed modification, so I want to see if Jason Berwin or someone else wants to respond to that question too. But we'll go ahead with the next question in the queue.
Good timing, Jason. Next. All right. So, yep, Jason, go ahead.
Sure thing. There's a lot going on here. Let me just try to make this brief in 3 different ways. The first is, I think what's happening here, right, is that people are seeing a desire to see certain abstract principles represented, but they're distributed across multiple categories. This is making it hard for us to do up or down votes on single items. What I would suggest is that we probably need to group these by, for example, the 2 or 3 overarching interests folks have. One of them is, for example, indicators of system need. That could include the commercial interests of off-takers, or that could be a separate category. There are also indicators for project viability. If we have those 2 or 3 overarching categories and you group these into those, then I think that might reduce folks' concern that voting up or down on single items is reducing the likelihood that we are in fact going to use some of those indicators, right? And so I know that you don't want to do a reorganization during this, but I'm wanting to make very clear that I think until that's happening, doing one-off discussions of each item, people are going to want to reference other items precisely because they are all in these kinds of buckets. The second is that as respects the procurement side of this, I think that indeed you could probably come up with several different criteria for meeting procurement orders or LRA portfolio plans, right? And so I can get you more information offline, but a criteria could be meets current CPUC procurement order requirements. That works for the jurisdictional LLCs. For the non-jurisdictional LLCs, you would have something like meets those non-PUC jurisdictional LRAs resource portfolio plans. And then you're capturing those. The LSC, the third point is that for the LSC awarding points, and I know there's some discussion of should that go to all projects or just those that do not meet procurement orders or LRA plans. My thinking there is simply that what's happening is that if the desire to express a preference is because things do not fit the procurement orders or LRA plans exactly, or there's ambiguity or grayness to it, that this would be an opportunity for the LSCs or non-jurisdictional entities to be able to put their thumb on those projects that they see as being in their interest. I am concerned that, as I've discussed previously, you need to balance the points here, or otherwise the meeting procurement orders or needs may be secondary, in fact, to just what is of interest to LSEs. And per my previous note, I think objective criteria should be what we bias towards rather than subjective criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and that was Jason Buren with GridStore. Let's go back to Eddie. It looks like he's reconnected. So Eddie Dashti with Pars Energy, go ahead.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay, very good. my comment is related to the off-taker letter of interest. I think that we're voting on issues that have not been fully developed, and my suggestion is that those issues that did not get enough vote should be sent to the work group for further development. For example, on off-taker, if it's an exclusive letter of interest, I think that carries weight. But if it's just left open, and an LSC can get letter of interest for a number of developers beyond what they intend to procure, I think that's basically gaming the system and should not be acceptable. So the devil is in the details and how you develop it. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to encourage you to let's develop it here. So if you have ideas just like that, shout them out.
Yes. Yeah. So what you want to do is do not allow the LSCs to issue letters of interest beyond what they intend to procure.
Can you say that one more time?
Let's say an LSC wants to procure 100 megawatts. So the total capacity of letter of interest that they issue should not exceed 100 megawatts.
Okay. So scaled to their need.
According to their need. So they should not be issuing letter of interest to anybody that comes and requests one.
Thank you. That's helpful. And that comment was for everyone here, not just you. That's why we're here. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, Grant Glazer, go ahead.
Thanks. This is Grant Glazer with Emanate. I have a question on this alternative to interest from an off-taker where LSCs could allocate points. The question specifically for LSCs is, I'm curious if you can share more with the stakeholder body what specific criteria you would be using to determine how you awarded points to projects. And really where I'm going with this is I'm wondering if there are additional criteria that we could pull from your methods of how you think you might prioritize projects and generalize them or include them as additional criteria here so that it's, I guess, a little bit less black box.
Is that a question more for?
Yeah, I don't know if, to your point, Danielle, if now's the right time maybe to have it answered, but if not, then I'd welcome any thoughts offline or in another venue. But that's all I had. Thanks.
Well, this is Bob Emmerich. A couple of thoughts that I've had, and I think even within the original discussion paper brought this up. One would be, based on what Eddie was saying, have load-serving entities that have a procurement process that will be taking place during a particular cluster period provide us their procurement targets. And the amount of points, however we set those up, would be, something like maybe kind of in the same vein of how we determine how many be studied, to give them more projects than they might actually need to procure, like 150% of that procurement target for that year. That would be the amount of points that they would get. Another one that was brought up was load share, based on the load share of each load-serving entity across the ISO system. Concern I've got with that one is you may be giving someone some points and they don't plan on procuring in that particular cycle, and so it wouldn't necessarily be quite as relevant. But that would, the first part would require the load-serving entities then to provide the ISO with their procurement plans for that particular cycle, so that we can utilize that information.
All right, thank you. We do have a couple hands raised. If you want to put your question into the chat, we'll take a look. But I think we're going to move to folks in the room for a second here.
Renee?
Thanks. Rev Renewables, Renee Steichen here. And so going off of Grant's comment, one thing that I had asked SCE offline is, because I see this as kind of, it could be like an RFP light type of process. And if it can be something transparent and non-subjective like that, you know, we could, I think that would be a better discussion right now. I think from the developer side, you know, we put a lot of money and time at risk early in the process, and, you know, to be able to create the best projects, to be able to go into normal RFPs. And so, you know, it's hard to think about having any sort of thumb on the scale so early. And, you know, throwing out an idea I haven't fully thought through, but just in that vein of developers are, you know, trying to create the best projects and putting money at risk. What if, as part of this, LSEs also put some money at risk in, if they're going to be awarding bonus points, that they have to also have some more skin in the game?
Thanks, Renee. Okay, anybody else in the room? Yeah, go ahead.
This is Aftab from SB Energy. So just taking a step back, right? I mean, how is it envisioned that LSEs would be handing out these letters of interest? Because when you're getting into the application, I mean, all you have is a POI amount of megawatts. Probably that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, but for an interest, maybe they need to see more, right? They need to see what is the expected COD, you know, costs, things like that. So I'm just in my mind, I'm struggling to see how is someone going to show give out a letter of interest with just the basic minimal information, not knowing what's coming, with the uncertainty that's coming ahead. So, but does this criteria even make sense from that lens? I think it's worthwhile to have that discussion.
Yeah. I mean, a couple thoughts on that. I think one is the hope of this process as a whole and the application of this scoring criteria is that it will encourage projects to do take more of those development steps earlier in the process before submitting an interconnection request, right? So it may ultimately, over time, evolve the development process such that developers aren't going to be filing their interconnection request first before they do everything else, right? There's going to be we want these projects to be a little farther along in the development process than some of them may be now. So the idea is that you do have more than just a POI and a project name, and that, you know, you have a vision for the project, and, you know, maybe you've made some investments in the project. Obviously, you have site control. You have a relationship with some potential off-takers that can be the basis of a letter of interest. Now, that's not to say that, like, just saying have a letter of interest is a sufficient scoring criteria. I think there's definitely a lot of refinement beyond that we need. But I just wanted to address that because I know there's maybe some, around this whole area of commercial readiness and off-taker interest, some frustration and concern that, like, none of this is appropriate this early in the process. But we are trying to build a process that looks a little bit different eventually as well, and that brings more advanced projects to the queue.
And this is Bob Emmer. Just to add to that, I'd actually like to ask the load-serving entities that are participating, not necessarily to answer now, but to think about it. Would you be willing, as a load-serving entity, to develop a process that is pre-cluster window, where you would request information from projects that would allow you to determine which of the projects that submit information to you would like to provide your points for? As was pointed out by others, you know, it'd be good to have a very transparent process around that, to where all of the developers know that the load-serving entities are going through this process prior to the cluster window opening, to where they are evaluating information from the developers on their projects to be able to make a decision of whether they want to support a project or not. Without some sort of a formal process like that, I don't know how a load-serving entity can actually provide either a letter of intent or some points that they would provide towards a specific project. So I think that's something that, in order to make this component work, we'd like to hear from the load-serving entities that they'd be willing to go down that road, which is basically a new process they'd have to implement.
Oh, and for the folks on WebEx, that was Bob Emmert with the California ISO who was just speaking. Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting on behalf of EDF Renewables. Bob, just to build on your point, I wanted to sort of just say out loud here that there are projects that enter the RFP processes before they have a queue position. That is a thing. So certainly, you know, if those projects were going through that process and being selected, seems like from a process standpoint, it could be done. Right. I don't know if the LSC would be willing, but it certainly is something that could work for some projects. And then sort of a question I wanted to pose to the group, and maybe this is a later term practical item, but we have like 37 LSCs, right? Do we have a plan or a commitment to make sure that they're all aware that they have this ability and have like time to sort of perform whatever light RFP might be necessary to, you know, decide how to divvy out their points? Good question. That's a good question. It's for the group. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that discussion has happened. Caitlin, did you want to? Sure. So I think for the sake of time, we'll probably move on. I do see some comments in the chat coming in and a few hands raised. So the folks with your hands raised, go ahead and drop your comment on this topic in the chat. We'll be able to keep that for our team here internally and look back on that. But I think we're going to move on. Okay, so the next category is probably going to be the same conversation, but commercial readiness, maybe a little more straightforward because there are actually processes here in place that we can think about, but and I'll move this down. But we had proposed a project being shortlisted, a project being included as a preferred resource in a non-CPUC jurisdictional one. I know that one has some hair on it, so that's why it's orange. An executed term sheet, which I think is relatively easy to validate, and then executed PPA. We also got a lot of pushback and comments to having an executed PPA on here. Just to give you our rationale, we were thinking that if you have it on there, maybe there's a chance or a rare project that does have a PPA, and shouldn't that project get some extra points for it? But we understand the concern that this can lead to destabilizing the PPAs or undermining the value of PPAs, and we don't want to do that. So let's discuss. Oh yeah, I see it.
Yeah, Ormat, as a geothermal developer, strongly supports having a PPA in place as a scoring criteria.
We do have a couple new hands raised online.
I mean, in order to get PPAs, I mean, typically they're asking for what the expected COD costs and things like that. So, I mean, how are we going to know we can have a view on what the expected COD is before getting into an application. So are we saying that we're going to make commitments based on, you know, uncertain views, highly uncertain at the time of beginning of an application?
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to imagine that a PPA level of commitment would be made at the beginning of an application, just based on, let's say, 50% view.
Yeah. I'm going to open that up to everyone. I mean, I understand the challenge there. Curious to hear if there are any gray areas that people can expand on or any answers to Aftab's question. Or proposals of what to do with this category of commercial readiness. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, this is Chris from Intergen. Since nobody's really chatting here, I think I'll just take a moment to just give our view in general on commercial readiness stuff. And I think we see that a lot of this stuff is being problematic and in general would be better for things like later in the process, like how it's used currently for deliverability and not upfront as a screening mechanism. So I think we just oppose in general using, especially the PPA piece, because we agree with everything that SP Energy just mentioned. So I won't reiterate that further, but I think we would concur.
So Abhishek Singh from Rev Renewables. So totally support what Aftab was saying from SP Energy. I guess is the intent here just to capture that odd scenario where a project might actually have a power purchase agreement so that it gets benefit? That is the intent. I know we would adjust the points. I think that points, what should that allocation, what should that point look like is something that we should discuss as well.
Okay. Bob, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I guess just to respond to that, at this point, I have to agree that that's what our thinking was, is that in the odd case, in the off chance that someone actually is able to produce one of these components, we'd like to give them points for that. What are the points? That's to be determined. We need to really work through some of those once we figure out what the final scoring criteria is. So let's not get into points yet, but I'd like to, with that being in kind of what our thinking is, even though we've got this desire that if somewhere down the road that things progress to a level where projects are actually getting further into a procurement process before they're studied, that's kind of, might be nice to have, but I don't know if we'll ever get there. So that's why we threw this out there, though, is to get some discussion around it. And, I'm kind of to a level I'd like to hear what people are thinking of, is the commercial readiness criteria, forget the individual details of the various bullet points that we have up here, is that worth keeping? From our perspective, we were thinking it doesn't hurt to have it in there, but we've heard a lot of concern about gaming and those type of things that people are very concerned about. So I just wonder, are people for keeping this particular set in there or not? Renee, you want to? Okay.
Okay. This is Lauren Carr from Cal CCA. On that point, and consistent with some of the concerns that were already expressed around the timing of when these points would be done and how early it is in the process, we would prefer to see this commercial readiness criteria incorporated into the LSC interest category, or I guess taken out and have more weighting put on the LSC point system, rather than having an additional category for commercial readiness. So once we get to the point of figuring out how much points each score or each criteria would have, maybe a better approach would be to put more weight on the LSC interest category once we refine that better with how the point assignment would work, and then take out that commercial readiness category. Like maybe if it's 20 points and 50 points now, you could combine it to 70 points and just have one category that encapsulates LSC interest.
And just to drill down on that a little bit, Lauren, when you talk about moving these up to the off-taker interest category, do you mean applying the points based on whether a project is shortlisted, or do you?
No, it would basically be taking the commercial readiness category out and putting more points into the category up top.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
And then when LSCs are assigning their points, they can take, any steps that they've already completed in the commercial readiness category, if there is any, into account when they're assigning their points.
Okay.
Renee?
Yeah, this is Renee from Rev Renewables. I was going to say basically the same thing, like combining those two categories. I think we heard Susan say it earlier as well, where those are quite duplicative or getting at the same intention at this point. And so if those are all options in the same LSC interest category, I think that could be okay. I think a real discussion on the points needs to happen at some point because, you know, if you're thinking about, Jason Berwin from Gridstore had talked about, you know, making these into like percentages just to be able to kind of see the weight of them a little bit better. And so I think a real discussion at some point needs to happen on that. Like, what's the weight of the LSE interest in this whole early stage?
Okay, so I proposed that change. It seems relatively simple, I think, and maybe arbitrary until we get to assigning points, and then it might matter. So is there any objection to just moving these 4 bullets basically up into off-taker interest, as it's all basically the same, trying to identify the same level of readiness from the same perspective, ultimately? Okay.
I guess the only concern, this is Jane Lockhart from NCPA, the only concern I would have potentially is that we need to somehow find a way to pare down the queue, and having some sort of development of the project beyond just a point, you know, it just seems like we're never going to reduce the size of the queue if we don't have some development going on beyond just putting in a point of interconnect and an amount. And so it just seems to me, because I don't know how all this thing's going to roll either. I don't know how these points are going to go or how we're going to get projects in. But I'm concerned when you're combining more and more categories and you're taking away things that might be a better way to get down to what projects are really real, because that's what we're trying to get to, is what projects are really real, which ones are actually going to move through the queue, which ones are actually going to get picked up by an LSE, and how do we get to that? And I'm concerned when you just start pulling off things like commercial readiness and chucking it entirely, or potentially moving it into off-taker interest, that maybe you're not going to bring the queue down to a size that's workable.
If I can just make sure I understood the previous couple comments, I thought it was more of a matter of organization and all of it being kind of a metric of the same category. So when we get to points, I think then you'll be able to say, like, what matters, you know, or what should be awarded more points. But for the sake of organization of the document, I heard the last couple of comments to say it's really no different than gauging off-taker interest. It's just maybe a different level of off-taker interest. Did I understand that correctly? But I understand what you're saying too. I think when we get to the, Jane, I think when we get to the points system, that's when we need to make sure that we're not actually losing, we're not talking about eliminating criteria right now. We're just talking about organizing them together or grouping them differently. Okay. Sean? Good. Okay, Rayanne?
Hi, Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting, EDF Renewables. It wasn't clear to me if we were talking about scoring yet, but I did want to put in there that it seems like shortlisted being 20 and the letter being 20 maybe is not the right weighting. Maybe the letter should be less, since going through an RFP and getting on a short list is sort of a indicative of a more mature proposal and certainly a more mature process on the LSE side.
I think we are not yet getting deep into the scoring, but I think that is a helpful. It's helpful to hear the relative ranking, and we can probably do some sort of exercise or poll about, or survey or something on which means more.
We do have quite a few hands raised online.
Okay, and yeah, comments are coming through as well. I don't know if we're going to respond to those in real time, but let us know if we need to.
Okay. Yeah, so let's go to Eddie Dadashti with Pars Energy.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. At the application stage, most developers are not in a position to negotiate a PPA because they don't know their cost. So, if you put in this criteria, it's going to favor basically organizations that have built many projects and they know the exact cost, then they can negotiate a PPA. at the application stage. But smaller companies and new companies that are trying to do business in California for the first time, they will be out of favor. That's it, my comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we get to the next person on WebEx, for those in the room, I know we're getting to the meeting today. If you need a coffee or water refresh, the refreshments are just outside the door to the left. All right, let's go to Loic Gayak with Southern California Edison.
Hi there. From the time I raised my hand to the time I got picked, a lot of things have happened here. So just wanted to state and be in agreement with the fact that this commercial readiness section was mislabeled. So that certainly should be considered as part of the interest from off-taker. And again, just I've heard a lot of concern about those LSE award points. Just the intent is not to make them cumulative to other interest from off-taker, but make them, have an or there. So you either get points from the LSE or you get points through the item currently listed under the commercial readiness. That's the intent was really to limit the influence so that, as Jason and others described, the idea of this LSE point is not to be the selecting criteria, but rather to contribute to that broader rubric of points. So again, you should have another mean to get those LSE award points, without having to get them directly from the LSE, but through those other interest from off-taker criteria that we are trying to discuss that we didn't get to. That was my broad comment. I think organizing those categories, as Jason mentioned a bit earlier, would be important because they all connect. So we need to make sure we weigh those rubric and criteria within the context of a broader category. I'll stop there just to be brief here. Another comment I put in the chat. It'll be great to have the chat open to all so that we can exchange and communicate outside of the getting on the call here, so that all panelists could see chat. I think it will enhance the meeting here. Just having the chat limited to the panelists is limited to the event producer is pretty limited. I think something to consider in the future.
Sumia Sastry with PG&E, go ahead.
And so I have to say I'm late to engage in this process, so I apologize for perhaps simple questions. But the way I'm listening to the previous workshop so correct me about what y'all are thinking about for the process here. So and I'm in agreement that you could structure these two categories that they can be collapsed, and we'll have to think about how to do that in a concrete way. But is the idea that the projects would submit packages to the CAISO, and then LSEs would be able to review that information and then have sort of an RFP within those projects and then assign the points? Because that process could make sense to me. Or rather, is the idea that this category, the expression of interest would, or term sheet would happen prior to submitting the package to the CAISO?
So I think the original idea was that the interconnection customer would be able to provide us with a package that verifies that you've reached at this stage, that these are your points, and then we would go through, look at your documentation, and be able to verify that. I think the addition of the points-based system is going to require, if we go down that route, I think we will have to think through how that fits in the process. So I don't think we have answers to your question yet, though maybe Edison or CalCCA has thoughts on the actual sequencing and timing of it.
Yeah, this is Bob Aaron with the ISO. That's something I've kind of struggled with a little bit after reading some of the comments, and I wonder if that's something LSEs would like to see, where the ISO would kind of be the one receiving all the information that the load serving entities, all of the 40 plus load serving entities across the ISO would then access the information that the ISO has received from the customers for, prior to a full interconnection request coming in during the window, and they could, access the information that the ISO has posted on those projects. That's one way of doing it. I'm not sure it's, that's kind of taking the ISO into a realm that we typically haven't gotten into, where it's like, okay, you're going to have to provide information on pricing and so forth of, what your cost is, what that, you may want to provide for the generation portion of your project, and that kind of information that the load serving entities could actually use versus something that's more of a internal process to a load serving entity to actually provide that information.
Sure, and I guess it wouldn't necessarily have to be price, but it could be some of these other commercial readiness showings. So like the site control, or the two items that are here, the long lead time procurement or supply agreements or engineering design process. So reimagining the process of how our procurement works, which is what we're doing here. It could be that is a way, getting everybody organized into the CAISO process would be a way to at least make sure all of the projects are reached and have met some hurdle. You wouldn't necessarily have to have the pricing, but then at least that has the LSEs accessing those who've met this basic hurdle and then working with them. And so you could imagine that it could be a little iterative, right? And then having something that after going through that process, having something that, whether it's the points based on load share or some sort of shortlist or execution document, that then those move into almost a second stage at the CAISO.
So I guess kind of comes, I think what might help make that decision is, from a load serving entity perspective, how much information do you want in order to make that decision? Are you hoping to maybe get some pricing information, which,
Sure, I think we would have
well, let me
to,
just finish. Let me just finish here.
Sorry.
So I'd like to hear what load serving entities might be thinking about that. Is that something they'd like to rely on the ISO, knowing that they'd get less information because it's going to all be public, versus running their own procedures that they might be able to get more information that's kept confidential, but that's a process that they're going to have to run. So I think those are the, kind of the tension, which way a load serving entity may want to go.
Sure. Other LSEs raised hands?
See, SoCal Edison with a raised hand.
Okay, and let's get a response to Bob's questions from.
And Sonoma Clean Power.
Okay.
So do you want to move? Okay, yeah. So let's start with Ryan Tracy with Sonoma Clean Power, and then after that we'll go to with Southern California Edison. So Ryan, go ahead.
Hey, Bob. Yeah, I think that, in an ideal world, I do like the idea of having detailed information, but I don't see us going, to the level of detail of everything that's in your interconnection packet. But I do kind of as a potential compromise, I'm wondering, one of the key things really is us looking at the technology mix and the time frame for projects. And I think as a fallback, if we can't figure out a workable solution to look at project level information to facilitate this LSE election, one thing that would still make me very comfortable is if LSEs had generic categories to rank, like let's say Northern California wind, the CODs in the early 2030s, Southern California wind versus battery storage, and being able to elect project characteristics at that level. And this is something that could even happen before the interconnection window closes. Maybe it's even public and developers know what those relative scorings are going into it. that's a potential compromise I'm kind of thinking about that might satisfy our issue with being able to drive interconnection requests to the type of resources we need. And I do want to kind of just take this point too to step away from the procurement order issue. Is the time frame for these cluster 15 future projects are well outside any outstanding procurement orders. So that's not, yeah, I think satisfying procurement orders is not going to be the main goal here. It's going to be trying to reflect what LSCs are seeing as the next batch of resources that they're going to need. Anyhow.
Just a follow-up question on that. It's a good point that a lot of the projects are beyond current procurement orders, but we also anticipate additional procurement orders. So what are thoughts on how we kind of account for that need and the timelines?
Well, I think you can, I still like giving LSCs the agency here because it's possible, for example, from Sonoma Clean Power's perspective, because we, like a lot of other CCAs, we've procured beyond our procurement orders. It's possible we've already got the resources in the next procurement order procured and ready to go, and we're trying to figure out the next batch of resources. So we'd be able to still have agency in driving those projects through the interconnection process and not necessarily be handicapped because we've been more aggressive about building our resource portfolio.
Thanks. And we're going to go to Edison and then Sushant.
Okay, and maybe after Sushant, we have Peninsula Clean Energy also. So like with Southern California Edison, go ahead.
I'm sorry, can you repeat who to unmute?
Blake Gayak. Southern California Edison.
Thanks. So to answer Bob's question, I mean, I think ultimately the intent was to have to provide LSE or provide access to LSE of the specific portion of the application that relates to those criteria. So it would be beneficial to have access to those rubric answer, for the lack of a better term, to leverage that data to issue those LSE points. That was the intent. We probably don't need to have access to the entire application, but certainly some key component locations, capacity, technology, POI, and answer to those rubric would be valid information to initiate other discussion we may have around price. So I think we're not expecting the ISO to add any additional non-CAISO related criteria in the application. That's something we'll manage on our end. But certainly having access to what is in the application and pertinent to that selection will be valuable.
Okay, thank you. Sushant?
Yeah, I wanted to expand on some of the points that LSE raised, where the scoring criteria that includes commercial readiness or offtake interest only makes sense if the step before that, which is providing information before interconnection request windows, that step is very well defined and made a lot more granular than what it is today. So there is the transmission capability estimates, prior queued results. There's a lot of data available, but it's not as granular. It's at a zonal level. So we think that is very critical. And going a step beyond that, I would throw out an idea where if CAISO can take on a lot more study effort, looking at future build, and portfolios is one guidance. There could be multiple scenarios that portfolios cover, but coming down to a more granular level of information at a POI level and not just zonal level would be very helpful. And essentially it would look like a cluster study for a portfolio, and then developers compete for those study results. And if one of those study results look good and developers say, okay, I want that study result to be mine. I want my name on that. And that's where developers can compete for commercial interest. And this would be a major change to what we have been talking about. Timelines may change, but I think that would be one way to solve this puzzle.
That's helpful. Thanks. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I just will say this, that I feel like our hands are a little bit tied with the FERC order from being able to propose something that is significantly different from what the FERC order prescribed for the for us moving forward. So keep that in mind, that our hands are a little bit tied based on the FERC order and how much leeway we feel that we can actually move outside of what that order requires.
In terms of the timeline in particular?
Well, in terms of actually developing something so brand new, where we actually say we're going to do a study process, or we're going to do a full-blown study process based on a portfolio, and then have some more of a process for developers to go then and look at that information and then however that process would work going forward, of developers using that information to provide their projects in the interconnection request window.
Caitlin, you want to move on?
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting. I think that's kind of where this conversation comes full circle, right? Is that we're all hoping that CAISO can provide some of that, even if just in the form of a slide deck, information about what your compliance efforts look like for that FERC order. I know you said earlier you're not obligated to provide that, and I acknowledge that, but there certainly have been instances, like for FERC Order 881, for example, where the CAISO does engage stakeholders on that. So if that information sort of clarifies this effort, it's helpful.
But I think bottom line is you can look at the order, and that's the direction we're going. So at this point, we're not planning on using the independent entity variance process to propose something different from what they're actually got in their order. So it's not so difficult to understand the direction we're going.
Okay, you guys, we can't talk about the FERC order anymore because we have 10 minutes left and we have to go to the...
Not FERC order. I'm going back to Bob.
Just checking.
Yeah, your point on your hands being tied on some of the things. But I'm thinking if there is a way to provide what the LSEs were looking for, which is directional input on interconnection outcomes and timelines, could be dollar per megawatt amounts at specific locations. Yeah, while complying with everything in the work order. If that's one thing we can achieve, I think the scoring makes a lot more sense after that, if that's done.
Okay. Are there more questions in the queue that we need to address, or should we move on to try to get some general thoughts on permitting first?
Yeah, so maybe let's just wrap up this LFC discussion with Doug Karpa from Peninsula Clean Energy.
Okay, and then we'll go to permitting.
A lot of what Ryan Tracy had to say from Sonoma Clean Power. It does conceptually seem to me that before the study process, we really are looking at categories of technologies, locations, timeframes, and then wanting to make sure that what gets into the queue is like kind of the right mix, that then we can start having discussions with those projects about price and PPA. So that may make more sense rather than trying to get price information. And I just also wanted to put a second little pin in the notion that we may not have future procurement orders coming out of the CPUC because of the RCPP proposal process, which should be coming out later this year, which if all goes well, will move away from a procurement order basis and onto a sort of 3-year, or may potentially move to sort of like more of a procurement target by larger timeframes mix. So I think we need to be a little cautious about relying on what the CPUC will or won't do, because we don't really know what it's going to look like going forward. But thanks for good conversation. I'm liking what I'm hearing.
Okay. So we're going to try to do at least get somewhere on permitting. We've got about 9 minutes. I was going to give time to Renee, if you still want to have something to present, and then give a moment. Oh, as part of this. Okay, so you don't need additional time. Okay, then we have a little more time. So let's see where we get on permitting. On permitting, initially, we had some ideas in here. Again, straw proposal. These were just ideas. So if there's anything you guys want to just shoot down right from the get-go, we're open to that. And go ahead.
Hi, Renee Steichen from Rev Renewables. I'll kick it off here. Just, I guess, an overarching on a lot of these things, there's been a lot of developer discussion about the challenges with a lot of these criteria because it is kind of flipping the development process on its head. And that's a really hard thing to wrap your mind around, putting thousands of or millions of dollars in a project when you don't know if it'll even get studied. And so there's just a lot of anxiety about that. And so, I understand the desire to have a more viable project move forward, but, even if you get your conditional use permit, which is like really far down the road, that still doesn't even guarantee you getting studied, and you have to wait another year and a half to get into the queue. So just laying that out there to start with, we were trying to think about what is a more manageable criteria to increase project viability. And, one thing I think about is having maybe at least a minimum set of criteria that you could have to be able to kind of guarantee that you're going to get studied. It increases your project viability, but doesn't require you to be, I guess, comparatively scored. But getting to some of the stuff that's on the page here, so I think indication of community support, I think we've heard comments that is just not viable because that is really getting the community involved, and it could be a good or bad thing, and that is not for a project that might not even get get studied. And who's the community in that? Is it the Chamber of Commerce? Is there local EJ? Is it, there's just a lot of problems with how to do that. The application of a land use permit, even that could really bombard local permitting offices and the local AHJs. And I don't know if they realize that this would be coming if this is a thing. And again, to the point that the project might not even move forward. And so I think this could be really burdensome for the local AHJs if we have any sort of, requirement for land use permitting on that. So, on the screen here is one of the things that we were talking about is if you want to just kind of make sure you're increasing the viability of your project, having a screening memo for done by an independent firm that, it's like the critical screening analysis or site screen, I think is some different terms used on that. And so that would kind of lay out, kind of what the initial issues are on your site and, potential actions for what to do. So that's one kind of tangible thing that could be done. And just wanted to note while I have the mic, on the box above there, a couple things we haven't touched on, the long lead procurement and engineering design process, I think are also along those lines of trying to, kind of do things that you are increasing your project viability. Yes, it's not super high bar, but it is something to show that you are kind of increasingly viable. And I'm not sure, I don't know if that would go in a project viability criteria or something along those lines. I'll stop there for now. Thanks. Thanks, Renee. Yeah.
This is Aftab from SP Energy. So just want to reiterate and add, reiterating the aspect that it is extremely difficult and expensive to, get permitting or pre-permitting. We're talking in the order of $500,000 and higher, right at the time of application. These, like Renee was mentioning, the conditional use permits, they usually have a life. You have to break ground, in a finite time once you get the permit. And looking at the current duration of network upgrades that are out there, you know, it'll most likely require renewal. Those permits will require to be renewed if CODs are beyond that finite time. That renewal involves risk. There could be change of boards and things like that. So, you know, there's a lot of, you know, difficulty, you know, expense and risk involved with requiring, you know, pre-permitting at the time of application.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we struggled with this category a lot. I know we struggle with it now sometimes on the queue management side. Sorry, I moved away from the mic. But what do people think of the proposal that Renee just suggested? Maybe with the caveat that it would have to be, there would be certain, not a rubric, but certain requirements of what that memo include and who did it. You know, like it can't be, you can't have your like high school son or daughter write a memo, but it has to, you know, if it is up to a certain standard, does that help provide some sense?
The screening tool is a nice measure to put into the rubric. I still strongly, just like the PPA agreement, you know, having gone through the CEQA process and the CUP process with local government, we're in the same queue. We can't, those things are very, very valuable. And if the goal is to narrow the queue, then these need to be in there and they need to be weighted, you know, given scoring accordingly. They're much farther along in the process and we're just bogged down in all of these lesser requirements.
And for those on WebEx, that was Carrie Rohrmeyer with Ormat Technologies. Thank you. And so just to be clear, you would say incorporate the screening tool, but don't take out the other permitting requirements? Okay. Then I think we do have to, and I know some thought has gone into this, but another issue that's going to be really challenging for the ISO is just the validation of those different permits. So to the extent that we keep some of those, we have to be really clear in the same way that we would for a screening tool that, you know, that those are easy to track down and we know that the process has started or that they've applied for a land use permit, et cetera.
So we do have 3 hands on WebEx. Let's go to Orjit Ghoshal with ES Volta.
Item. You can lower my hand.
All right, looks like we lost you. If you want to, okay. Let's go to Grant Glazer.
Grant Glazer with M&8. Just to reiterate some of the points Renee made and maybe go one level further. We also like the screening memo proposal. I think in our comments we called it like a preliminary survey for impacts on, we listed out 3 things: 1, environmental impacts; 2, cultural impacts; and 3, wetlands, which it's my understanding that those are often the kind of the 3 big categories that would maybe jeopardize a project's likelihood of getting permits. So I think I hear the point that Danielle made about it being difficult to verify these memos or these surveys. I'm wondering if it might be possible to use the CEC land use screens, which I understand we're using in other parts of this process as well, including bus bar mapping. But it's my understanding that those screens have you know, data specific to sites, locations in California that would or would not qualify for, or might be reasonable indicators of whether a project is going to, you know, trigger or raise red flags, or have a harder time of ultimately having success with permitting. So that's one thought, is maybe starting with that as a default, and then if a project doesn't pass a land use screen, then the developer could use like I don't know, a verified assessment or survey in lieu of that. But yeah, that's all I wanted to add. Thanks.
All right, Jason Buren with Grid Store. Jason, looks like you dropped your hand, so let me know if you want to speak. Ryan Millard with Next Era Energy, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ryan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I think we're supportive of the concept of the permitting plan, and we see it as possible for Cluster 15, Cluster 16 projects, but it could potentially be highly subjective in terms of whether the permit is viable. If the criteria is just having a plan, it's very accomplishable, but if it requires compliance with specific code or showing a successful pathway, it could get pretty tricky to meet. So I think we need to also balance how far we dig into the specifics of it. And then always also remember that, you know, I don't think this criteria is meant to necessarily be exhaustive. It's meant to just, to some degree, check a box. So that's my only comment on that.
Thank you. Let's go back to Jason with Grid Store.
There we go. Hello. Hi, thank you. I can support the screening memo approach. I agree that it's probably just going to create a floor that everyone needs to satisfy. So that can be helpful potentially if there's like a minimum threshold for entry, but I think for actually discriminating amongst projects, it may be not so great. The thing I would note is that I would propose to strike many of these permitting questions. I think that if you actually walk through how you are going to do this, how do you define which permits? How do you make sure that there is a actual process that the ISO can follow that is not administratively burdensome? Note that a lot of permit work needs to include things like interconnection facilities and maybe some network upgrades. If those are not even known, it is impossible to include them in a permit. Permit cost is also significant. As you know, it can be things like $500,000 to do your CEQA, and doing that prior to even knowing your study entry status is quite significant. Permit expiry is also significant. If you only have a 1 year or so, maybe 2 years most, opportunity to have your permit, and then it is revoked because you do not act on it because the process is taking too long. There are a lot of reasons why I think, and then I think has been brought up before, if you tell people to go make applications, you are going to swamp local agencies. They are going to probably reject permits if they feel like they are overburdened or that they are frivolous. You will also need people to sign affidavits stating that they will not withdraw applications once they've gotten through the screen. I just caution, as you try to operationalize these things, it gets very complicated and very administratively burdensome. And while I totally respect and appreciate the desire to reflect project viability through permitting, because we do know permits are a significant barrier to success, at the stage of an interconnection request, this is very, very challenging. And I just want to, I'm not trying to say you can't do anything. I'm trying to say I'd love to be proven wrong and have folks show up with very workable criteria. The best I can come up with as well is a screening memo. Thank you.
I'm going to go in the room real quick to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Chris with Intergen. We would just like to concur with everything that Jason just mentioned from GridStar. And I think we are concerned that there's going to be some real subjective things that come in that the CAISO is going to have a lot of challenges with, and also, you know, strongly agree with the part about worrying that this can push the problem to another jurisdiction and have a bunch of folks rush to do permits and then really bog down, especially some of the counties that we're very active in.
I'm going to maybe tease out something in Renee's idea, or the idea of a screening memo, and see, this is just fresh thinking, so forgive me in advance. But if the screening memo required like at least a checklist of what the required permits would be for the project, would there be value in using that checklist as the project moves through the interconnection process? So like assuming that that project gets studied, then could we refer back to that screening memo to say, you know, to help in the queue management process to assess how close a process is, or how close a project is to readiness? Or is that, and this is a question as much for the ISO team as it is for stakeholders. So on the fly thinking, any value?
This is Jason with the ISO. I think my initial reaction to a screening memo on the queue management side is hopefully we're seeing, by the time you've finished your study process and you're proceeding through, your TPD, seeking TPD processes and hopefully project development, that you are further along in this process and have at least started some level of permitting. So just a memo, I don't think would support the development process ongoing. We'd want to see more strict criteria, and I think we'll see in the next paper a little bit of a different look on permitting and commercial viability criteria. And then I think my only other concern there would be validating a memo, who it came from, the validity of the research behind it. We can take the word of the customer, but I think we also need to consider like a trust but verify sort of situation where we have some ability to say, reach out to the person who wrote that and have a conversation or some type of validation of what it actually means.
Okay, thanks.
We do have a couple of hands on WebEx. So let's go to Eddie Didashti with Pars Energy.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a couple of ideas, and I want to see what the group feels about it. What about location of a plant in a fire zone? That's not something the ISO would want, and public in general would not want. So that's idea number one. Idea number two is, what about limiting the amount of megawatts at POI? If you have 1,000 megawatt application at 230 kV, that's not going to be viable. It's not going to electrically provide you with a feasible project. So these are very easy to implement and could benefit the whole California grid, I think. That's it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, just two more hands raised online. I know we're getting close to the end of our meeting here. So Luke Gayak with Southern California Edison, and then we'll jump to Jason with Gridstore to wrap it up.
Just a really brief, I think we're supporting of the concept of this screening memo for the reason Jason described. However, it cannot only be a memo that identify issue, but it need to provide some information about whether those issues will be able to be resolved to support the project. So whether it is remedial action and a path to remedial action, or any other mean that will indicate that not only issue have been identified, but a resolution path has been put together. And as it relates to how do you vet that, I mean, I think it will have to be done by some independent organization, and it would have to be some level of standard in place, so that from a CAISO verification perspective, the process is easy and doesn't require, you rely on some independent entity that, vet the project against a set of criteria. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Jason, go ahead. All right, Jason, just re-raise your hand. There we go.
Here we go. Sorry, I keep taking it down too early, and sorry for taking up a lot of oxygen, but I have been spending a lot of time thinking about these. I also just, in the last remaining time, I want to suggest that I don't know that energy community as defined by the Inflation Reduction Act is a meaningful criterion on which to select. I note that that is a significant incentive that already developers are speaking to. Again, think through how to implement it. Those maps will change over time because of the nature of employment and how it is linked in energy communities designation. Does it count the map at time of interconnection, the time you come online? The safe harbor is later than when you're doing a request. Also, it's unclear what system need or project viability that provides. And then finally, on the expansion of existing facility, I think where there's spare capacity at the gen time makes a ton of sense. I would think that that would apply to the POI or substation as well. I don't know why expansion of an existing facility without spare capacity would be considered something to highly weight, because it is likely to have both still permitting challenges because you're using new parcels potentially, and also because if it needs upgrades, that does not make it somehow any more sort of speedy for the purposes of interconnection. You could ostensibly have a non-operational facility like a closed plant be used. You could have, in fact, any previously disturbed industrial site. And those would potentially all provide the same kind of opportunity that an existing facility would. So I would recommend, if this idea is here, it be spelled out exactly what the rationale is and why that shouldn't apply to other previously disturbed sites or, for example, retired sites. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. There's one more, and then I think we're going to give a couple of stakeholders a moment to just wrap up with some ideas that they've been thinking through offline.
All right, Mark Turner with TerraGen, go ahead.
Yeah, real quick on permitting. So I think that permitting is not something that CalISO will be able to effectively and fairly evaluate in the early stages of development. That job is the job of municipalities that have the jurisdiction and evaluate those criteria. Permitting as a threshold can be effective possibly at a later stage in the interconnection process, but if the CalISO tries to evaluate permitting and the viability of projects in the early stages, it won't work. Don't have the expertise to do it. Not even evaluating some third party's consultant report. It won't be effective and fair for you to do it that way. What you can evaluate is whether or not a project gets a permit, right? After those that are experts, the municipalities that have jurisdiction, have issued the permit. That's at a later stage in the permitting process. So I think that's the only way that evaluating, the viability of project permits can work for the CalISO.
Okay, thanks. That was helpful. I think this is where we're probably going to pick up for our next working group, but I wanted to give a few of the stakeholders who have been participating in these conversations over the last week a moment just to kind of summarize some other thinking that's been going on around this. So in particular, I was going to turn to Renee Steichen from Rev, Jason from GridStore, if you have more to say, and Loic or Virginia from Edison. But if there's anyone else too who wants to summarize some additional thinking, we can do it quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. This is Renee Steichen from Rev Renewables. I'll try to be brief here. So, I know we don't want to talk about Order 2023, but just linking it back to there, I think one thing that, you've been hearing from the developer community overall, a lot of angst about some of these criteria that are forcing things earlier in the development process in order to get points, in order to get studied. I really think there's a lot of opportunity to instead, or could be in addition to, but start with raising the baseline for requirements. In particular, site control, I think as we've discussed before, I think that's clearly an opportunity to cut out a lot of the projects, that will, with cluster 15 right now, that'll cut it more than half if we started that today. And then increasing study deposits and withdrawal penalties along the way. I know you've talked about just meeting the Order 2023 requirements and without variation, but there are a lot of other regions that are doing that differently, with, requiring, for example, increased dollar per megawatt in order to enter the cluster study process. And then if you put more of that at risk along the way, that is something that developers will definitely respond to. And if you know that you have X amount at risk, or if you're having to put up X amount as a deposit, even with the letter of credit, that is something you will be more scarce on. So I think you will get a lot of response in the request time by doing some of those things. And then there's, you know, the options to implement some of these criteria if needed, whether it's having a minimum set of requirements, you know, just to increase the project viability, like we talked about with the, you know, doing a site screen analysis, or having a little bit more elbow grease in the site plan engineering design. You know, there's some options there. And then, I don't know if this could be in addition to or instead of, but having more requirements along the way in the process. So some of these things, of course, a project is going to have to do if it is going to stay viable. And so, but it's just having it at the interconnection request time that is so challenging. And so, you know, it might not make sense at the request time, but requiring it after, you know, after the cluster study phase, or before you sign your LGIA, or, you know, something along those lines, where, without pointing to specific criteria here, but kind of moving these instead of at the entry point to throughout the process, can be another way to kind of show that a developer is increasingly viable, and that it is raising the bar along the way, that a developer is going to be thinking twice about if they know that they have to meet, you know, XYZ criteria. So there is kind of a working draft on that. I'm not sure if it'll be ready to present on the 15th, but something to we'll be working on. Thanks.
Hey, this is Jason with the ISO. Does some of that proposal apply also to the queue management, time in queue, commercial viability, or is it more geared towards just the application point in the process?
Yeah, some of it is certainly queue management. But, you know, part of it was looking at some of these criteria and, you know, moving it to a different stage in the process. So there is some overlap, but not totally, yeah.
I certainly look forward to seeing and hearing that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Renee. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Quick reaction. This is Chris Devon from TerraGen. I think we would support the ideas that Renee just put forward, and you know, we really do think that there's a chance that some of those other aspects, the baseline stuff, could make a significant difference, and then we could still continue with some sort of a potentially phased process where there is more of a queue management aspect to it with some of those other things that we expressed concerns on. So just wanted to put that in there. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, and then I was going to see if Jason or Loic wanted to say anything else about the conversations you've been having over the last week and any suggested next steps.
All right, I see Jason with his hand raised. So go ahead, Jason.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Thank you for helping us work through this. I think that the conversations that the small group of stakeholders, including the SCE folks, has had, I think it just reveals how for each of these items, if we do not have clear, precise definitions of what the criterion is and a means by which that can be assessed, it becomes very challenging. And I think that we have to grapple with those for each of these items. I think also that these things connect to each other. These ideas, for example, that Renee has just shared about increasing baseline requirements, that matters in terms of what the scoring criteria are, because if, for example, you reflect greater project viability indicators in the baseline requirements, like site control, financial viability, et cetera, that then raises the question as to how much they need to be or are appropriate to be included in the scoring criteria at what weighting. And I think it's important, in fact, my request to the ISO is that we have to come back as a group to talk about these things as completely as possible if we're going to make progress. We have to have criteria that are fully spelled out in definition and assessment method. And I would argue that you have to look at these as packages, not as one by ones, because they are a portfolio of assessment. And so I guess my request is that stakeholders come up with plans, not just ideas and red lines to single criteria. Thank you.
And this is Aftab from SP Energy. So just want to reiterate some of the comments, like Renee was mentioning, and we've also mentioned in the comments online, is with the implementation of site control, all the FERC Order 23 requirements, all the withdrawal penalties, and also providing transparency on the heat maps, and hopefully those heat maps are not just capacity and also cost information. I think that in itself should incentivize or de-incentivize developers to move forward or not move forward. And I would question even the need to have any scoring criteria to on top of already the things that are already coming. I think we should give these significant changes on site control and the FERC implementation a chance, see how it goes first, and then in the future, if the way things progress, if they warrant further changes, then maybe introduce something. But like folks are mentioning, it's too subjective right now to understand.
Well, this is Bob Nuremberg with the ISO. Just to respond to that, I don't have confidence that all of these things put in place without some sort of scoring criteria to further reduce them, that we will have a cluster that we can actually manage. And the last thing all of us want is to have cluster 16 be put on hold as we have to do some additional work in order to implement new things, in order to get the cluster group down to a sizable amount. We need to do this now. And if we can always adjust things moving forward, but I think the ISO is firmly in a position to say, we're going to do this now. We can always make adjustments later, but we're confident that we provide all the information you would all ever want. And we will see an abundance of projects at the most viable locations many more times than we would ever want to study. So that's our position.
And I want to add to that too. I hear this tension and the anxiety around use of the scoring criteria, particularly early in the study process, but I just want to remind everyone what the purpose of the scoring criteria was in the SRA proposal still stands, I think, for the ISO, where we still feel that we need some way to assess commercial viability and the likelihood that that project is going to be viable and advance to COD before studying all these projects. And without good site control indicators, we're going to be left with an auction, which is a much more blunt instrument. So I know there's still discussion of what goes where and some staging, and I think there's some room for discussion around whether things should be moved to earlier or later in the process, but we do still need some criteria to look at to make sure that we're right-sizing the number of projects for the study process. So I just wanted to keep that fresh in everyone's mind as we go into this next couple weeks of discussion. Okay.
Yeah, one quick comment. This is Abhishek from Rev Renewables, and we do see the concerns that you guys are anticipating, but it hasn't happened yet, right? So I mean, this optionality of complying with FERC 2023, what state we as in CAISO would be in, we don't know. So I'm just, one alternate mechanism could be that we keep discussing what we are discussing, but apply it on a case-to-case basis. So for, let's say if cluster 16 turned out as you guys are expecting, then you already have a working proposal in place and maybe go back to that. But until unless that happens, I think we should give FERC 2023, the basic requirements that are there. They should be given a chance, before coming up with these requirements, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. We note that. The other piece that I want to note is the scoring criteria. If Order 2023 does have a significant impact on the number of projects submitting interconnection requests or the number of viable interconnection requests, the scoring criteria as proposed can still let all those projects through. So it's really only used in cases where there is this abundance of resources that we think is too large for us to study. So there's no harm in applying the scoring criteria because there could be a relatively low threshold for getting through it if the baseline requirements are that effective. Hopefully that provides some comfort.
So let's get some final thoughts from Lloyd with Southern California Edison. Go ahead.
I'm still puzzled by some of the comments that we're hearing about relying on a gating process only. I think we have to restate what the overall goal is. The overall goal is to keep the application below a specific target. No gating mechanism can accomplish that. It has to be a scoring to draw the line at that target. I mean, whether we like it or not, the only mechanism other than the auction, as we discussed, which really should be used as minimally as possible, is that scoring mechanism. It's difficult to come up with score, and as Jason mentioned, that can be operationalized and maintained. And yes, I mean that's difficult and may take some time and some revision. But I think the idea of not having a scoring is just, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't accomplish the goal we have. So my other comment is supporting what Jason said. I think we need to really have a reasonable grouping of those criteria so we can have a discussion around the intent of the group. So if the intent of the group is to look at interest of off-taker, for example, then we can have all the criteria pertinent to those, and then we can look at trade-off between one to the other, and so on. Similarly for the other category. And coming back on gating, we need to be cautious as the gating mechanism is not too stringent, and now you don't have enough projects. So the intent of gating is certainly to bring the volume of project down, but it should be sufficient to satisfy the 150%, and then you can apply on top of that your scoring criteria. So it's finding that right balance, I think, is going to be difficult, and it may take few iterations. And as Bob mentioned, yeah, it's likely the project may evolve over time. But if we want to make QC 16 and apply some of those to 15 to some extent valuable, we need to be able to rank, score, whatever we want to call it, those projects. As difficult as it is, we need to come out with some reasonable attribute that can be managed.
All right, we do have one last question on WebEx, and then we'll wrap it up. So let's hand it over to Susan Schneider, and then we'll close it out.
Yes, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I wanted just two things. One of them is to just keep raising the issue of this qualified commercial entities and where they fit in this process. But the more fundamental one is you've got this 150% total, which I think as Recurrent pointed out earlier is a megawatt total, and that's important for the reasonableness of the study results. But we still don't really have a feel for the number of applications, which is sort of the administrative part of the process. And so if you get down to 150% of, on the capacity side, but you still have too many applications, then it seems like you still have a problem. Is that where the auction comes in? Or so the idea of how we really don't have a definitive answer yet, similar to the 150% of what is the total of number of applications. Are you going to be looking more at larger applications because you get more capacity in for the bang for the buck? Anyway, it would be very good to have some idea from the CAISO and from the PTOs what is administratively, what can you handle in a reasonable amount of time for processing cluster 15. And so in the future, it'd be good to have some thought and perhaps some response to that.
Susan, this is Bob Emmert with the ISO. I think our perspective is if we get the number of megawatts down to a level that is the appropriate amount to be studied, we can handle the number of actual interconnection requests. That's not the criteria that we're looking towards. So I think that's where we're at.
Okay, because you've got a tremendous variation in the number in the sizes of projects. You got, I think, 65 of them that are 1,000 megawatts or more. And then you've got, a bunch of other ones. So I just, okay, so you're not, so that's not, you don't see that as a limiting factor here. That it's something where you got your 150%, but you may still have too many applications. You don't really see that as a realistic scenario here.
No, I don't actually.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll close it out with that. I know we're at time. Thank you, everyone who joined us in person and on WebEx today. So real quick, the top bullet point there is the link to our initiative webpage. Again, that's where the presentation from today's meeting is. We do have our next working group meeting on November 15th. And that's going to be 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Also with a hybrid in-person option. We'll be in the room next door. So the link to register for that is found on the daily briefing notice that went out. And then if you have any questions related to that, you can send an email to ISO stakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. So thank you everyone for joining on WebEx, and we'll see you next time.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.